Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from whichever part of the world you are joining in. Welcome to the Ashank Desai Centre for Leadership and Organisation Development Leadership Lecture Series. As a part of this lecture series, we bring to you an eminent personality, an academic or a practitioner to come and share insights from the research, from the work that they have been doing in the areas of their interest and their specialization. So we are very happy to have with us Professor Prithviraj Chattopadhyay, who is a professor of management at the University of Auckland. And he would be talking about a very important topic, which is why does diversity matter? Understanding the impact of demographic differences for organizations. Before we go forward, let me introduce Professor Chattopadhyay to all of you. Professor Prithviraj Chattopadhyay, previously, before joining and working as a professor of, he is currently working as Professor of Management at University of Auckland. And before that, he worked at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology from 2007 to 2016, Australian Graduate School of Management from 2001 to 7, University of Queensland from 1998 to 2001. He has also worked at Western Michigan University from 96 to 98 and was also a visiting scholar at Duke University in 2004. Professor Chattopadhyay has had industry stints at Eureka Forbes Limited and the Tata Management and Training Center, Pune. He holds a postgraduate diploma in management from XLRI and a PhD in management from the University of Texas at Austin. His research interests include relational demography and diversity, managerial cognition, and employment externalization. His research has been widely published in some of the top journals in the field of management, such as Academy of Management Review, Academy of Management Journal, Administrative Science Quarterly, Journal of Applied Psychology, Organizational Science, and Strategic Management Journal. He has been an associate editor for the Academy of Management Journal from 2016 to 19, and is also currently a member of the editorial board of Academy of Management Review, Academy of Management Journal, Journal of Applied Psychology, and some of the top journals. So the list is very, very wide. Well, he has won numerous research awards for his work and research. That includes Academy of Management Review Best Paper Award in 2007, Making Connections Award for the Best Symposium Organization Behavior Division in 2007, Best Student Paper Award in the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division in 2000, recognition for outstanding service to the Journal of Management Editorial Board 2006 to 8, and to the Academy of Management Journal Editorial Board 2007-10. He has been an international visiting fellow for the UK Economic and Social Research Council, Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, Advanced Institute of Management Research in 2005. I have had the good fortune of working with Professor Chattopadhyay on some of his research works, and he is a brilliant researcher, academic, and an absolutely wonderful person to interact with. We are delighted to have you, Professor Chattopadhyay, with us. Thank you for taking out this time. It is quite late in your part of the world, but thank you for accepting our request, and we look forward to listening to you.
Thanks, Vishal, and thank you for having me. And thanks to the Ashank Desai Centre for inviting me. And, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. It's quite late here in New Zealand, as Vishal mentioned. And if I sound a little bit tired or if I yawn, it's not because I'm bored, it's just, yeah, I'm a little bit, perhaps approaching my bedtime. Anyway, looking forward to sharing my research here. Let me just get this thing done. What I'm going to talk about is on demographic diversity, but I'm going to focus my particular take on diversity is focusing on differences between individuals in the team and other team members. It's to me, diversity matters because we understand these individual differences, and that's what I'm going to try and convince you over the next hour, 45 minutes, hour or so. If you have any questions, I guess Vishal will handle the questions and you can interrupt me whenever. I'm going to present to you some of my work over the past 20 years, and I'm going to then present a paper that I'm working on right now, which, and hopefully give you a good idea of this area, and then the new paper will give you an idea of where the current work is heading. Okay, so diversity, why does it matter? Well, to most people, look at diversity as a team level effect, where people bring in all sorts of different knowledge, background, and so on when they are from different race. So demographic diversity is what I'm talking about. And those differences within the individual's demographics are tied to different ideas, different perspectives. And when handled well, this can lead to the team as a whole performing well. And when handled badly, it can lead to the team performing badly. Now, what I'm going to look at is how the individual actually encounters and reacts to and diversity, and how the individual fares in this scenario. That's something that a majority of the field kind of ignore. They look at team level effects. This particular subfield is called relational demography. And it's something that's been a passion of mine. So this kind of a black umbrella and yellow umbrella slide kind of illustrates what I'm talking about. For a diversity researcher, they would be looking at, well, how does this entire combination of black and yellow, how do they perform? But for me, it's important to understand that the yellow umbrella person might be reacting to all the sea of black umbrellas a little bit differently. And as the proportion of yellow umbrellas grow, the black umbrella people might be looking at it a little bit differently. So, those reactions with people belonging to different categories, as it were, that's where my focus is. So it's it's a very much a quantitative approach. It's one that focuses on, for example, where how people react to their teams in terms of how much do they feel they belong there, how much they feel they want to stay on over there, how much is their individual performance affected, and so on. But it all started, this area, a while back in the 1980s and late 70s. Economics and sociology academics started looking at cohorts and studying the well-being and mobility patterns of cohort members. And based on that, some of the early management scholars started looking at functional and tenure and age dissimilarity And they looked at it based on the similarity attraction paradigm, which is a very simple theory. It just suggests that you are attracted to people who are similar to you. And so you have better outcomes in terms of, how motivated you are, and therefore you might perform better and you stay there longer and so on. So that's the kind of thing they looked at. And more distant individuals are therefore more likely to leave. So in terms of, for example, if a lot of people are young and one old person, that person would be more likely to leave according to this basic framework, because they would be a little bit unhappy in that team. Now, I too got into this similarity attraction paradigm work, and one of my earliest works looked at whether top management executives, whether we could predict how similar their beliefs were to other executives by looking at age and functional background similarity. And we didn't, in fact, find that those patterns. However, there were also patterns that didn't match this very simple idea. And in order to really explain that, people introduced social identity theory, because it helps to give a little bit more of a complex model, which helps us to look at all the different outcomes of being dissimilar, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, and so on. So this particular theory suggests that when people belong to a team, they want to build a positive identity based on that team membership. So you want to feel good about being a member of the team. And people use this idea in terms of dissimilarity by saying that, well, perhaps you want to look at whether the whole team is filled with similar others, and what we call the in-group. And if, in fact, people are surrounded by similar others, then they feel better, they feel more identified with the team, they're more likely to feel valued, they trust the in-group members more, and they work a little bit harder for the team. Now, this is something that works well for some team members, but it doesn't for others. And what the difference is, why we need to look at, or the way that we look at why it works for some and not for others, is by looking at their status. So we introduce, and this is something that's at the core of social identity theory. It suggests that gaining status is a good way of feeling good about yourself. So if your team is high status, you also get to share in that status. And so how does that matter for diversity? Well, we know that society provides, treats demographic characteristics, demographic attributes differently. So, in many societies, most societies other than matriarchal ones, men are typically given a little bit higher status than women. And this is also echoed in organizations, and that most top management teams and boards and high-level managers typically tend to be male. And even though women are catching up, they're still nowhere near 50%. So perhaps that is echoed in the organization. In the West, in terms of race, white Caucasians are given higher status, and they tend to be part of the top management team a lot more. And people of color, whether you be Black or Hispanic or Asian, South Asian, whatever, not given quite as much status in the West. And in India, and by the way, I will present a couple of papers with some Indian data later. We may suggest that some people are given more of a high status, perhaps in terms of gender, or some religions. There are schisms along religious identity, caste, social class, and so on. So yeah, status makes a difference. Now, how does it make a difference in terms of dissimilarity? Well, if you think about high status people, and let's talk about men and women, that's the simplest one to talk about. Men, when they are surrounded by similar others, they get to identify with the team a lot easier, because not only are they surrounded by similar people, but they're also surrounded by high status people, because the organization treats all men, gives them a little bit higher status. For women, it's a little bit different. You can either surround yourself with similar people, a lot of women around, and that can give you a sense of identity. But you also have, how do you get ahead in the organization? You might get ahead more if you belong to a team which has more men, because that is a higher status, and that can translate into more resources and better chance of promotion and so on. So women have to typically make a choice. So how do we understand the reactions of the lower status category people when we look at dissimilarity effects? And so in order to understand this, my colleagues and I wrote a theory paper in 2004, and this has guided my research for last 15, 20 years, these ideas, but it's nicely encapsulated in this little figure here. It suggests that not only individual status matters, but also the characteristics, the attributes of the status hierarchy in which they are embedded. So again, looking at men and women, maybe the organization gives higher status to men, but is that higher status seen as legitimate and stable? So that's along the left-hand side there. If it is, then we react to it in a way that, well, you accept it, take it for granted. But if you don't accept it, it can lead to social competition, which is the top left box in that figure. Now, on the right-hand side, we suggest that, well, there is another aspect of the hierarchy that we need to consider. We call it permeability in this literature. And this is whether some people can get ahead in the organization and go from low, convert their low into a higher status. So some women, you in an organization might see there are 1 or 2 top managers out of 15, 20, let's say, who are women. So there's a signal that women can be mobile in this organization, and they accept the fact that, while men are given higher status, as an individual, they can get ahead. And so whether it's legitimate or illegitimate status, they don't worry about it. So both those boxes, we suggest that they are going to enact a social mobility strategy. And then finally, there's social creativity. I'll come to that later. But I'm going to try and flesh out these boxes for you. I have a number of papers on each of these boxes, and I'll show you some of the data from there so that it helps to visualize what's happening in each of these situations. And this data come from the US and from Australia, from Hong Kong, mainly. And later I'll show you a couple of Indian papers as well. Right, so this is social competition. Remember that this is where people are saying that it's illegitimate, the status is viewed as illegitimate. And my data show that, well, yes, so this kind of creates the typical social competition, the in-group versus out-group tussle that we often think about in terms of diverse teams. Each category is trying to assert their own superiority. And my data show that the category that is in the majority, that is sort of got a lot of people who are perhaps more than half the team members belong to that particular category. that's those are people who are not so bothered by diversity, but it's the people who feel swamped by the other category, who kind of feel they're losing the competition. Those are the ones, perhaps, who have the more negative outcomes in this kind of situation. And as you can see, I've studied, competition in terms of, well, do people feel that they can trust their in-group, they feel attracted to their colleagues, do they feel valued? Organization-based self-esteem is a feeling of value. And are they, as a result, more altruistic, a form of citizenship behavior, which is really useful in organizations. In the second paper, we looked at identification and conflict. And there are other papers that we looked at temporary versus permanent employee, standard employees in a couple of papers. And you find similar competition, status competition effects. These are some of the papers, but I can give you more details later on should you ask for it. But this is a typical slide from one of those papers. You can see here the y-axis altruism we're trying to predict. And along the bottom is race dissimilarity. The data are from a couple of high-tech US companies. And these clearly show, and in these companies, the non-white race members had kind of been recruited in a large scale, and the white people who were traditionally held the majority, they were feeling a bit swamped in these companies. And as a result, you can see as race dissimilarity increases, the white people, their altruism goes way down. The non-white people, that line is pretty flat. They're not affected quite as much. And the reason why they withhold their citizenship behavior is that they started to distrust their colleagues. They started to feel less valued by the organization. And that's what led to this particular effect. Now, the next slide is from Australia. It's a bunch of Australian scientists. And they were all, the organization was very male dominated. And the top management was all male. And although the women scientists, they were very, extremely well qualified, obviously, to get the job and so on, but they were not treated as kind of equals. They had to fight for everything. And so we decided to study conflict in these organizations. And we find that, the women, they were faced much less conflict when they were with other women, but when they were with other men, they found a lot more conflict. They reported a lot more conflict. And they were also similarly felt less that they belonged in those organizations, in those teams when they worked in teams with a lot of men. So you can see here, comparing these two slides, that diversity matters in these two scenarios because social competition is going on and one side is losing and one side is winning. Now, this is not always the case. Like I said, when a few people from the lower status category, they feel that can get ahead, it kind of diffuses this competition. And then we have something called social mobility, where the people from the lower status categories, they feel that they can, by taking on the values and beliefs of the higher status categories, they can be accepted there. And so in this kind of scenario, in this kind of status hierarchy, we actually find that women and men, and in this case, non-Australians and Australians, they're all happier when the team has a greater proportion of the high status category in their teams, because everybody benefits from being in such teams, and they all have better sense of their self, they identify more. So, and we replicated this with the standard and temporary employees in another organization of Australian scientists. So this is what it looks like. Self-prototypicality is simply looking at whether you define yourself and you see yourself reflected in the team. And so you identify with it, and therefore you're likely to work much harder and so on with the team. And here you can see that as nationality dissimilarity increases, Australians, who are the high status category here, they're much happier when they're surrounded by other Australians. When the non-Australians who wish to get ahead by becoming like Australians here, they are much happier when they are surrounded by a lot of Australians. So both Australians and non-Australians feel that the team really reflects who they are when the team is full of Australians. So this is a typical kind of scenario you find when a few people are allowed to get ahead from the lower status categories. Therefore, this signal in the organization is that, yeah, we value everybody with, if you're of merit, and everybody wins in this scenario. The lower status people can believe that they can get ahead. The higher status people can don't feel guilty about keeping people of good merit down. So yeah, it's a kind of a win-win situation. But the problem with this scenario, of course, is that the status hierarchy it remains in some form. Right.
So if I can
yeah.
ask a clarificatory question on the last slide, Professor Chattopadhyay, how do you define, how is self-prototypicality defined there? How do you?
Yeah, okay. So it's like I was saying, it's how much you see the values and the beliefs defined in your sense of self. So you see that you might describe, for example, the team as being very hardworking and very collegial, and you see those values reflected in yourself. We found that people were much more likely to describe their team in these sort of positive ways if it was full of Australians and if it was full of men in this particular sample. And then they said, well, I'm like that as well. And so that's the self-prototypicality. Yeah.
So if you can go back to the last diagram, it shows that non-Australians, they tend to show higher kind of this behavior. So they tend to value or talk in better sense about their team when they are with dissimilar people.
Yeah, so they value being in a team full of Australians. Yeah, so they see that's where the high status is. Those are the people who are getting ahead, so they would want to define themselves. So it's a kind of interesting situation because they're leaving behind their non-Australianness in a way and trying to fit in, and that's what's driving it. And the same happened. I don't have the slide for men and women, but the same happened. The women were in this particular scenario were much happier when their team was full of men because those were the higher status people in this particular scenario. So. And the self-prototypicality is particularly important in this regard because it tells you, it informs your sense of self. And I imagine leaving your femaleness or your whichever non-Australian country you belong to and trying to fit in and feeling better when you're with, and feeling that yourself is reflected much more in the team when it is actually full of the other category people. So it's a very powerful thing that drives this kind of behavior that we want to gain status, so we leave our old selves behind.
Okay, so they show higher tendency to do this. Yes, that is what is happening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Right, and I also wanted to show you this particular second study that not everybody is like your personality makes a difference as to whether when you're given the opportunity to be mobile and to leave your old self behind, people who are more authoritarian or more dogmatic is the personality measure that we use. It's a kind of authoritarianism measure. And we find that people who are high on this, and they believe in the social hierarchy, and they believe that they kind of belong at the bottom, but they're willing to forsake their own category and to move up by sort of cozying up to the higher status people. Though that's so people who have this dogmatic personality, they're much more likely to engage in this kind of attitude and behavior. And you can see here, they feel much dogmatic. So this is an American sample. People who are more authoritarian, they feel valued more when they're with the dissimilar, white, in this case, the white majority race team was dominated by those people. Whereas the non-dogmatic minority, they are much happier when they're with their own kind. So, when you don't accept the status hierarchy, when you're not authoritarian, you actually like to be with your own people. But when you are dogmatic, then you accept it and you feel more valued when you're with the white majority. So that's a kind of a more nuanced way of looking at it.
What would OBSE stand for, Professor Chattopadhyay?
Organization-based self-esteem. It's do you feel valued in the organization?
In the organization, yes. Okay.
Yeah. Right. So, like I said, I've covered two of the three kind of reactions people have. This is the third one, and it's social creativity. And this basically says that, well, when this is a scenario that unfolds when you have people who are in a status hierarchy that is legitimate and stable and impermeable, which means that, there's no way, so you take the status hierarchy for granted, and you cannot go from low to high status, no matter how long and hard you work. So what happens there? There is an impact of diversity, but this again looks a little bit different. But where do we find it? Well, I studied a team of surgeons and nurses. And if you think about it, well, surgeons are typically male, nurses are typically female. And nurses, they can feel that they are kind of good, caring people. They can feel superior about themselves, build a positive social identity by looking at themselves as team players. But these are not relevant to gaining status in the surgical team. The high status people are all the male surgeons. And so what happens in this kind of team is that, well, the surgeons, because their status is not threatened by any other category, no matter how many nurses there are, they don't care. Their status is safe. So what do? They fight amongst themselves. You put too many surgeons into a team, and from our data, we find that they are abusive towards each other. They kind of try to outdo each other. One time we even found in our data that one person threw a scalpel during a surgery. So when do we expect to see this kind of behavior? And when do we expect to see lower levels of negative emotions and behaviors? Well, to see that, we can get into this. So the bottom here, we have functional dissimilarity. So it simply means that, well, for nurses, functional dissimilarity means that there are many more surgeons. For surgeons, it means there are many more nurses proportionately. And on the y-axis, we have negative emotions and the sorts of behaviors I was talking about. And no surprise here, both surgeons and nurses feel, they react much more positively when the proportion of nurses is higher. So for surgeons, functional dissimilarity, more nurses, their negative emotions and behavior go right down. For nurses, the opposite happens. You have many more surgeons in the team, then they can cope with. Their negative emotions and behaviors go right up. So this is a form of diversity related effects you find when the status hierarchy is legitimate, stable, and impermeable. So yeah. So just to recap, we've been looking at all the lower status and the high status category outcomes for the social mobility, the social competition, and the social creativity. And they're all described in terms of the three aspects of the status hierarchy in which they're embedded, which is the legitimacy, stability, and permeability. Right. So moving on from this, I'm going to just briefly talk about a couple of papers that used Indian data that published in the last 5 years. Here's one of them that was published with Vishal last year, about a year ago now. And here we looked at simply, does dissimilarity have a negative effect? And we hypothesized that depends on the emotions that people feel when they first view their team members. And we said that emotions, although they are fleeting, they tend to have a very long lasting impact because people tend to behave in the same way even when they leave that first meeting. And so we suggested that people who are happy in that first meeting, so it's a little bit more complicated than this, but people who are happy when they leave that first meeting, they are likely to believe that that dissimilarity is a good thing. They view it through sort of rose-tinted glasses. They believe that they will get all the benefits from being in a diverse team. And they interact energetically with their team members and they gain influence as a result. People who are angry, they tend to obviously have friction with their team members, and because of these interactions, they lose influence over time. And people who are sad and associated emotions, they tend to use this sadness as a signal that something is wrong. And they tend to work at solving that problem. They become more analytical. And so these people gain influence in the team over time if they felt sad in that first meeting. And we, in fact, find these kinds of patterns. So here, this is the happiness pattern. The orange is the high happiness people. As you can see, it's going up. The red is the low happiness people. You can see that as the teams have people from more different parts of India, intranational dissimilarity is higher. They tend, the people who are low in happiness, they tend to lose influence over the project, and people who are higher in happiness, they tend to gain. This is the people who felt angry in that first meeting. And you can see here that the more angry people, they lose influence because there's a lot of friction between them and the other team members, whereas the people who are low levels of anger, they tend to gain. And these are the sadness, and the orange is the high sadness people. You can see they tend to gain influence over time. The red line shows that, the people who felt low levels of sadness, they didn't become as influenced in the project over time. So this is a kind of the Indian context, it shows us that these kinds of dissimilarity effects can be found in India as well. Here's a second paper that I wanted to talk about. This is a paper where we essentially looked at newcomer socialization, and we said, and this is in a software company in India, one of the top software companies, and we said that if when people come in to a big company like that, well, they come in because of the high levels of prestige that they can see from the others, from the organization, from all the others that they would work with, and once they joined, and so on. This prestige, if they continue to see this kind of prestige, they feel that their psychological contract has been fulfilled. What they looked for, they have found it. And as a result, they tend to stay in the organization. But when people feel that there is less prestige than they bargained for when they joined, then they tend to leave the organization a lot more. When do they feel that there is more or less prestige? Well, as it happens, when you're surrounded by people from your region who speak the same language, eat the same food, and so on, you feel that the organization is still as prestigious as you would expect it from the beginning. And this particular figure shows you how this unfolds over time. So we collected data when they first joined, and you can see at the bottom there, time 1 is when they joined right at that time. Time 2 is the formal socialization, when they're kind of sitting you down in a classroom setting or whatever and telling you all the good stuff about the organization. Time 3 is the sort of informal socialization, when people are kind of wandering around the organization and trying to learn the different things about different aspects of the organization, all the different departments. And time 4 is when they're finally given the project that they wanted to get. And as this particular graph shows, at the beginning, the people who joined with people who are like, they're a little bit higher, but which is the line at the bottom, the dotted line. But at formal socialization time, they really start to believe a lot more in what the organization is telling them. And then in informal socialization, everybody kind of loses a little bit of, the organization loses its sheen a little bit. It's a period of uncertainty. People are settling in, not yet got your first project, you're kind of wondering what you're going to do, who you're going to be working with. That kind of uncertainty drives the prestige down a bit. But at the end, as you can see, these people pick up a little bit as they get their project. The black line at the lower level, that's where the dissimilar, people who had dissimilar colleagues, they start out lower and they stay lower all the way through, and they're much more likely to leave the organization as well. And this is a very interesting paper in terms of showing that, the prestige that you're attracted to, it can, depending on how you feel about that prestige, in your first few weeks and months in the organization, it can lead you to stay or to go. And you can see here, so the people who felt that it remained prestigious because they were surrounded by similar others from people from the same region. They felt their psychological contract, which is sort of a kind of mental contract over and above the legal contract, sort of, is the organization living up to its promises? People feel that way when they're surrounded by similar others. But they feel when your colleagues are all different from you, you don't feel that way. And that's not logical or rational, but that's how we react to dissimilarity in some occasions. In this organization, this certainly happened. So these are the two kind of sets of data that I wanted to yeah.
If I can just ask two questions here.
Yes.
Chattopadhyay. So it shows that in general, the prestige does come down in both the cases.
Yeah.
This is coming, and you said time 4 is when they are just starting their projects?
Yeah, so you can see there's a little bit of a curve back, and and that is significant as a matter of fact. Yeah.
So is there any again in terms of your research on the diversity or what could be the reason, because it is from the time that they are coming in to the time they are starting to get onto the project, prestige tends to come down. So is that perhaps a bubble that is getting burst when you are told a lot of things when you have to join an organization, but you come into the organization and you then realize
Yeah.
what I
So I'll explain it a little bit more. What's happening here is, if you look at the top line, the upward curve is when you're in that classroom setting, and you're hearing a lot more good things about all the wonderful things that you can expect, and your package is maybe explained a little bit more, and you may be given a little bit of understanding of your kind of skills you learn and the kind of people you work with, and the kind of projects you'll do. So it's an exciting time. And although it doesn't really talk, they're not trying to enhance perhaps the prestige more directly, but that's the kind of outcome. You feel excited, and when you ask people, is this still a prestigious organization? They give even higher scores, right? Next time is when you're kind of wandering the halls almost, or maybe you're kind of told, you are sent for a day here, 2 days there, you're introduced to somebody who drops you off with somebody else. You're basically getting this sort of informal socialization that many organizations have while you're waiting to get into your first real project. And that is a time of great uncertainty. And you meet some people perhaps that tell you negative things, right? Because they're not bounded by the classroom kind of situation, and they tell you, here's the real story, and watch out for this guy, or so you hear those kinds of things, and so the prestige, that kind of uncertainty, it rubs off on the prestige. And again, I said it's not rational, but it comes down because of this uncertainty. When you get your project, you can sink your teeth into that. You start to get into the routine of the organization. You work with others, you get a regular team, or you get you'll be definitely in this place and not that place. Or you'll be working on this kind of a project, not the other kind. So that kind of certainty, again, helps to rescue that feeling that, okay, this is why I joined the organization, and there's a little bit of uptick there. So that's what's happening. But all of this is conditioned on whether you're with similar people or dissimilar people.
Yes.
You can see
What this is telling us, that if you are with people from similar background, then perhaps there is the prestige decline is relatively lesser.
Yes, correct. Right? Yeah.
Okay. So the other question is more of a clarificatory. Somebody has asked in the chat, if we can go back to the previous study on the team influence. So what does ULE, HP, and
okay,
so that people have
yeah, so PHE is pleasant, high activation emotion. So this is happiness and those kinds of emotions. Yeah, so I was talking, I was trying to present, so this is a representative emotion. It can also be enthusiasm, joy. There are few emotions that come together in this bundle. UH is unpleasant, high activation emotion. So I mentioned anger, could also be frustration. So what were the other emotions? Anyway, emotions like that. So unpleasant, high activation, and ULE, unpleasant, low activation, like sadness. So I mentioned sadness on this slide. And so those are the three types.
Okay, we can go.
Right, yeah. I sometimes tend to kind of go right over that. So yeah, thanks. Good to be clarifying it. Yeah. All right. So I mentioned the Indian data. This is now I'm going to talk about the final, the paper that I'm working on right now. And this is sort of looking at how do we counteract these negative things that happen. Well, one of the things that, that has been mentioned in the last decade or so, and has been really getting a lot of traction in the research world, implementing an inclusive climate. When you implement an inclusive climate, and it means that you're giving fair treatment to everybody, that is irrespective of their demographic attributes. You're valuing all the individual employees, again, irrespective of demographic attributes, and you include them in the core decision making. So this is kind of implementing an inclusive climate. And we wanted to see if, when we looked at diverse teams, if doing this would make everybody be equally likely to engage in voice behavior. And voice behavior is described as intentionally expressing work-related ideas, information, and opinions. So, when you see a problem, do you kind of give voice to it? Do you engage in problem solving actively? And this is very important for diverse teams, because this is why we bring diverse teams together, so that everybody can get involved. Although if they don't, then you lose the point of having a diverse team if only some group is speaking up and the others are keeping quiet. So this is something which has been worked on a little bit, but they have ignored status. Now, the particular demographic attribute that we wish to look at here was disability. This is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It is important that 1 billion disabled people, 15%, who live with some form of disability, and 80% of them are working age. And the rate of employment for disabled people is rising in the corporate world. But there is a stigma associated with disability, and higher status typically given to the able-bodied more than the disabled. And the more disabled you are, so disability severity, the lower the status. This has been looked at, established. So we wanted to see what happens when you try to be inclusive in a team which has both able-bodied and disabled people in it. So we theorized that if you take into account the status of effect, we departed from the previous literature, which suggests that everybody would want to welcome an inclusive climate. And we said that, yes, inclusive climate is good. It does improve feelings of belongingness, and a stronger climate gives a greater perception of being an insider, sort of like identification that I've talked about earlier. And since more severely disabled people feel like an outsider, maybe the climate, if it is stronger, it'll give them even greater impact on inclusion. So that's the positive side. On the negative side, we hypothesized that people who are normally outside may feel anxious when they're included. So it's nice that we're all given an opportunity, but we all recognize that when you're given a chance to perform, we all get a little bit socially anxious. When many of us academics, even before we go to any class, we feel a little bit anxious. And we said that people who are, even more severely disabled will feel, and they feel relatively more of an outsider, their feelings of anxiety will be greater. And this anxiety and the feeling of insider, they're both related to voice behavior, in that insiders engage in more voice behavior, but anxious people, they reduce their voice behavior. So the full model kind of looks like this. You see on the left, perceived climate for inclusion. So treating people well, giving them active participation, involving them in core decision making, and so on. They do feel insider status more. And we expect that to be for a stronger effect for the more disabled. And also there's a negative effect in terms of, well, I should say a positive correlation between climate for inclusion and social anxiety. So the stronger the climate for inclusion, or the stronger the perception, the more the social anxiety. And this is stronger for the more disabled people. And then each of these lead to voice behavior, like I said. So that's the full model that we're testing. This data is from China, two firms, one manufacturing solar panels, the other medical devices. And those are chosen because they have a mission to promote social equality and to help the disabled lead a better life. And we collected data across 3 waves with 2-week intervals to try and make sure that the common method error is mitigated a little bit. And one author personally distributed the surveys and to employees in a central place. The final sample had 585 participants in 112 teams. Of these, 214 were disabled. That's about 37% in 73 teams. And you can see at the bottom there, the kinds of disability we're talking about. Physical disability in one or more limbs, hearing disability, visual disability, verbal, intellectual, and both hearing and verbal, which is a more composite kind of disability. And all the percentages tell you about what percent they're represented in the disabled employees. The measures are all pretty standard. Perceived inclusion is from Nishi's scale. It's looking at people, whether they're integrated in spite of their differences, whether they're involved in decision-making. That's from the definition. Perceived insider status, which is in wave 2. So we measured perceived inclusion, so the dependent variable in wave 1, perceived insider status and anxiety, which are the mediators in wave 2, and voice in wave 3. So we separated those out. And as you can see here, insider status is capturing belongingness to the organization. Anxiety scale is 10 items looking at anxiety experienced in kind of situations you would expect to find in a team. So working with others or making a presentation, whatever. And voice is a 6-item scale, that is Van Dyne and Lepine scale, whether the people make suggestions and arguments on important issues. The disability severity, this is Chinese government data. They give certificates to the organization, and with their permission of the employees, we collected those certificates and we coded them. And so the able-bodied are 0 to 4% impairment. There are a bunch of us who have a little bit of problem with our eyes or our hearing. So we count those in up to 4% in terms of being able-bodied. Mild disability is 5 to 24% disability. So that's a mild disability, whether it's hearing or whether it's limb or whatever. Moderate is 25 to 49. Severe is 50 to 95. And comprehensive is when you have multiple disabilities and you need to take care of multiple problems with your functioning. Now the sample includes 63% able-bodied, 12 mildly impaired, 8 moderate, 3.9 severe, and 12.6 comprehensive. So it's fairly well distributed across the different levels of those disability severity. And I can come back to this later, but all I wanted to say here is that we used multi-level modeling because we wanted to measure individual reactions nested in teams. And the second thing we wanted to mention was that we used the Monte Carlo method for assessing mediation. Otherwise, the data shows that we're pretty much on track with our approach. So here you can see the black arrows, they are the significant arrows, and the red ones where we did not find support. So perceived climate for inclusion, it does have a main effect on perceived insider status, which does lead to greater voice. And there's mediated effect is also significant. So that's a good thing in that implementing this does have an impact on everybody in the organization. Everybody feels more of an insider. And it doesn't matter how disabled you are. Everybody feels more of an insider. So the moderated effect did not eventuate in this case. Social anxiety, the main effect didn't get supported, but the moderated did. So the more severely disabled you are, the more anxious you are when you are more included. And this leads to lower levels of voice, and the conditional effect is significant. So the more disabled you are and the more included you are, the greater your anxiety, which leads to lower level of voice. So this is an important result because it helps us to think through, yes, it is good to implement a climate for inclusion, but we should also think differently about people who typically given lower status. And they may feel anxious because usually they're not included as much, and they may feel a bit anxious when they are included. And the lower the status, the more this problem is. So for a manager, this is an important thing to consider. And this is the sort of interaction effect, which shows exactly what I said. So the low disability severity at the bottom, yeah, it's pretty flat. That one is not significant, but the high disability severity, they get more anxious as they're more included. So conclusions from all of these papers together, to say that status is of consequence in understanding how individuals react to working with demographically different teammates. Understanding the nature of the status hierarchy is very important in this regard because your effects can be flipped completely around depending on the legitimacy, stability, and the permeability of the status hierarchy. And so if you're looking to understand your diverse teams, you must understand how that is going to play out in your particular organization. The same effects, same differences may come into play, status differences, when you implement interventions to include all team members. And so when you try to solve the problem, you should also keep track of the status and understand that inclusion can be good, but people may feel a little bit anxious as well. And that's it from me. Happy to take questions.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Chattopadhyay. So there are a few questions here. I also have a few and I'll ask in a while. So one of the questions is, how would you say the works that you have been working on, what could be the implications for these ideas on immigration and subsequent assimilation?
Yes, so immigration and subsequent assimilation, that's what you're talking about. It plays out in terms of, if you are talking about assimilation, you're talking about social mobility. So people, that it assumes that there is an established majority culture, and that people who will come in, they will all wish to be partaking in that particular culture, and they will wish to be assimilated and to see themselves as becoming that particular nationality wherever they're going to in terms of immigration. But the situation is not always that simple because sometimes people feel that they cannot be socially mobile They are kept in their own communities. They don't feel that they can get ahead. And in those cases, yeah, perhaps they can engage in social competition sometimes. So you know, around the world, there have been situations where different communities, fights between different communities have been breaking out. So in the US, the Black Lives Matter, similar kinds of situations in Australia. In India, there have been sort of conflict between different communities as well, different religious groups. And this is a situation where there's people are saying that assimilation is not what we want. We want to be also respected for our own values and beliefs. And so it's more of a social competition. Now, like I said, assimilation is much more likely when you actually create a belief that people can indeed get ahead, and that smoothens out conflict. It helps people to become you know, much better at working together. But often the problem lies in that when people who are kind of in these, say, the new immigrants, they come in, and when the high status majority, they feel a little bit swamped. When the numbers are too high, then it turns from a perception of mobility to a perception of competition. And that's the fine line that has to be balanced between these two.
Yeah. Also, just building on this question, what is the or how would you relate these findings also to affirmative action? So India, there is a lot of affirmative action where you have the general and the reserved categories, and so we have in our admission processes, we see affirmative action. Even in the US, we have. So you have a group which could be perceiving themselves on, or maybe perceived as of a different status, but they are brought in, and then they work together, and there could be a lot of stigma also attached to it. So
Vishal, you're breaking up a little bit.
The voice is breaking.
Yeah, it's kind of got a bit choppy there.
Yeah, so I will repeat my question. What I was asking is how do these ideas get extrapolated to affirmative action? So in India, there is a lot of voice today about affirmative action, and even in jobs in certain states and certain communities. So what would be the kind of advice to organizations, policymakers, leaders, if they have to implement affirmative action?
Well, affirmative action is something, you know, that works to give a signal to the people that you wish to include, that yes, they do in fact have a chance in this organization. Now, the extent to which it works is the extent to which they can actually see themselves as being represented in the very top of the organization. You know, often organizations will give people a chance, but then they're kept at the very lowest levels. They're given, you know, sort of, so they're taken in, and, you know, if it's a numbers game, then you get maybe a lot of people at the lower levels. But if then, you know, if they're falling through the cracks as, you know, as the career progresses, and then you find that, no, in fact, this is not social mobility in action. It is, you know, we're being kept in our own place. And so my advice to organizations is that, you must actually establish that there is a pathway for people to indeed get ahead over time in that organization. Now, of course, you can face a backlash. And typically, my research has shown that when in any team, when the lower status categories, the ones you wish to include, they are crossing the halfway mark, or then that is the time when people start feeling swamped, and then they fight back. And in India, there has been a lot of affirmative action, and I think there has also been backlash because some people have felt, well, there are so many reservations and so much that what chance do we have? So then from social mobility, it's a very fine line between social mobility and social competition. And typically, if you're talking about 20-30%, you're probably okay. You're getting towards the 50% mark. You're in trouble in that regard. So that's what the data suggests. Now, I'm not a policymaker, but I can tell you what the research shows. So that's what my research and other research in this area shows.
Yeah, so very interestingly, I was reading in today's newspaper, actually in India, there is an interview by a cricketer in the Yorkshire Cricket Club.
Oh, yeah, Rafiq.
Yeah, Rafiq. Yes, and he does mention that in his team under the captaincy, they had 4 Asian players, and the captain said, I would not want to name that captain, but the captain said, well, we got to do something about it. And those 4 Asian players never played a game together again. So that because your numbers are increasing. So in one match, they had 4 Asian players playing together. So the captain said, well, we need to do something about it because your numbers are increasing, and they never played a game together again. So I think that's the 50% mark that you just mentioned, when people start to take note and become defensive, and there are backlashes. And
that's exactly right.
So maybe one last question, because we just have a quick is there a kind of a relationship? Very interestingly, you mentioned the inclusive climate, and it can also create social anxiety. Any quick thoughts on what could organizations and maybe leaders do to tackle this anxiety and the negative relationship with the voice behavior that you saw in this research?
Well, I mean, yes, I would say so. In addition to making sure that there is inclusiveness, we also talk about a climate of safety where people are allowed to make mistakes, where people know that they're not punished if something goes wrong, that people are encouraged to take risks, encouraged to learn from their failures. That kind of thing, if it's simultaneously included, I think, there's a lot of research since Amy Edmondson came up with this concept, and it seems to show that these sorts of anxieties are mitigated when you implement that side by side. So yeah, I would definitely advocate for that.
Okay. So essentially, if I understand, the anxiety increases because these individuals believe that they are being treated a little more specially or differently, so they tend to become a little more apprehensive, and that leads to the anxiety.
Well, think about it in this way, that you're usually left out because of whoever you are, in this case, disabled. But I could say, if you're typically, let's say you've gone to another country and you are left out of the decision making because you are from another country, you're an immigrant. And then suddenly you're told that, okay, today will be your big chance. You've got a chance, and, come, from now on, we're going to include you. It's a good thing, but you can also feel anxious, right? Because, so that's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Okay. So I think it was a very, very interesting talk. Once again, Professor Chattopadhyay, thank you for taking out time and staying awake for us and giving this very, very interesting, full of insights. And what I can take away is that very interesting framework about the social competition, social creativity, and social mobility. And the important thing to keep in mind is when you have people, relational dissimilarity, especially of different kinds, it is not just enough for organizations to say uh, we are being inclusive, but they have to demonstrate the permeability, which Professor Chattopadhyay mentions, that you have to show in organizations that, well, you can have people of different backgrounds coming in, but there is also an opportunity of moving up into the organizations, or be it educational institutes that we are seeing affirmative action in India, be it organizations. I think that permeability makes a lot of difference. And the other thing, which was very interesting research that you are doing and talking about inclusive climate, but also ensuring that inclusive climate is complemented with a safety climate, or very interestingly, we call it as psychological safety as a construct in organization behavior research, that there is an opportunity to fail, there's opportunity to take risk and experiment. And that would be a very important signal for people from diverse background when they're looking for getting assimilated and getting accepted and being mobile in the organization. So once again, on behalf of the Ashank Desai Centre for Leadership and Organization Development, and me personally, it has always been a pleasure to listen to you and to your ideas and thoughts, and the very, very interesting and important research that you are driving on inclusivity and diversity in organization. Thank you once again.
Thanks very much for having me.